Hello, welcome back to ASP.NET Authentication with Identity Jumpstart. Hope you joined us for Module 1. If you just happen to be signing in now, welcome. We've got a lot of great stuff to cover today.
Here we are once again with Concealed Identity.
Concealed Identity. I really want the hat and the mustache. It's just glasses is all we can come up with in this short notice. All right, Jeremy, let's talk today about locally authenticated users. Things that you are not authenticating with an external provider.
So this is one of the methods of using ASP.NET Identity, right?
One of the methods, one of the handful of methods that we can use here. So there's a couple different ways that we can use locally authenticated users. So what are locally authenticated users? That's what we're going to look at first, followed by customizing your SQL database and entities. Since out of the box you get an entity framework implementation, we're going to talk about customizing some of those, therefore customizing your SQL database, and customizing the type of user store. Let's say you want to go ahead and you want to access, I don't know, MySQL, RavenDB. We're actually going to look at a RavenDB demo before the end of the day here, so something really cool is coming up too. What are locally authenticated users? Users not authenticated with some external third-party provider. Typically, these are the ones you've been using for ages in web forms and MVC. A SQL back provider, right? You're authenticating against your SQL backend. You look in a user table, use a membership provider, universal provider. This is typically the way that we've done things in ASP.NET for many years now. Since
I like to call it roll your own identity.
Roll your own identity.
Yeah, it's the term local is a little bit confusing because it's local to what? And it's actually local to the server. You know, you're the developer, you're working on a server, you're doing authentication right there on your server. Might be a separate database, but you're doing the authentication right there.
Local as in first party, as opposed to going out. And even that's a little ambiguous because you might still have Active Directory on premise, which is the water gets a little muddy then.
Yeah, slightly murky.
Slightly murky. All right, so authentication code, I like to think about it, exists on the same server, although technically it doesn't have to. There's surely ways you could break that out, but let's keep it simple for the sake of this demo here and understanding the basic concepts. Let's get right to our first demo, looking at a locally authenticated user. So let's go back to Visual Studio here.
New project.
New project. So I'm going to go back in and create a new project here that will work.
Now, there were a couple comments in the chat room about Visual Studio 2012. If you're used to 2012, you may, when you see this new project window, you may notice a lack of a whole bunch of different project templates, and that's because there's one ASP.NET. It's all rolled into the ASP.NET web application, and then you get to choose features that are plugged into your ASP.NET application.
Yeah, it's a little better organized, in my humble opinion. So I'm going to start out with MVC. We'll talk about web forms again briefly, but all of that code is pretty much mostly the same throughout what I'm going to show you this first demo. So let's get to it. I'm going to create a new individual user account again. So for everything we're talking about in this module, we're using individual user accounts. I'm going to create that project. Okay, so what we're going to do here is run it for the first time. So we'll get that database created. And we looked at some of that database schema in the last module. I'm going to register. This is a new application. So it's a new database. So I'll register that same user account again. And again, this hits our SQL backend. So if I come in here and I stop debugging, I open my Server Explorer again, pin that puppy out. We've got default connection. So that default connection, and I didn't talk about this before either. If you look in your web config, and this is the same for web forms and MVC, this guy right here. Default connection, connection string, local DB. So this is using, think what used to be the common thing you use was SQL Express. Or you could go against full SQL Server, but then that had some difficulties. You had to install full SQL Server on your system. Then we had a SQL Express, which is a much easier, smaller install of that, uses the same runtimes behind that. Then now we have local DB, which makes it real super easy. It just spins it up the instance when it needs it. And so that's what we're using here, local DB. And we're using those same, this has existed for a little bit here. Attach DB file name that says look in our app_data folder. That's what that means, our data directory. And this database right here. If it's not there, it'll go ahead and create it for you. So that is what is being read to show you this magic right here. Our default connection. So I created my one user, so I should see that user in the database right now. Perfect, I do. Now, you're fighting with your DBA. Your DBA says, listen, you're doing this all locally. There's going to be some words here if you don't give me some sort of scripts that I can use, or how are we going to get this out to production? And you say, aha, I've got the perfect idea for you. So let me show you what I like to do here. We're going to open up a package manager console. So tools, NuGet package manager console. And that gives you, let's clear this console, this empty window here. And from here, you can do all sorts of things. If you want to install some NuGet package, you have a GUI to do that. This is the interface that I like to use. I love, let's say I have a web application, and I want to install jQuery into that package. The jQuery package into that application. Got a little hang here so it goes out to the internet. This has IntelliSense built in that actually goes out and queries packages that match that name. So if I wanted to install jQuery in here, it's already in here, but if I wanted to install jQuery, I could use this package manager console to do that. That actually adds an entry to our packages.config. And you notice, we have all these pluggable packages that you can install separately and you can upgrade or remove separately. That is really what forms all of the web templates nowadays. You have these bite-sized packages. And as such, you can install all these into a completely empty web app too and build it all up from there. But what I can also use this package manager console for here is some of our Entity Framework stuff. And I said you don't need to understand Entity Framework to be able to work with the identity system, but I'm going to show you some of the advantages of being to know a couple things about Entity Framework that really allow some cool features. So check this out. First thing we want to do, enable migrations. So there's a feature of Entity Framework called migrations. And what we're going to do is tell Entity Framework what our system looks like. And it's defined in our Entity Framework implementation in Microsoft's libraries. Basically, we have a class, it has some fields in there, and so Entity Framework looks at all that data and says, oh, I see you have an email address that's a string, so I'm going to create a field in the database based on that. And you have this other field, I'll create a field in the database based off that. And so the more that we customize this, Entity Framework will give us those code changes, the SQL scripts to make those changes to the database. But we haven't made any code changes yet. We just want this stuff right here. And so let me go over to some little scripts here because it's easier to copy and paste some stuff. So we've enabled migrations. I'll talk about this command in 1 second here. Let's go back. I'll show you the same command again. I press the up arrow on my keyboard, shows me the last command. Update database. So I'm telling it, Entity Framework, migrations, I want you to update this guy right here. But this dash script says don't actually update the database, just give me the scripts that you would update the database had I let you. In other words, if I ran this without any parameters, that will actually update my database for me and take this SQL and apply it on the database. But I just want to see what that SQL looks like. So I'm saying just script it out for me. And in turn, show me the very first migration. In other words, the initial state of my database here, show me that. So that's what this little command is here. And if I look at my SQL statement, this is everything that I need to create that database. So I talked about these tables here. This one I didn't talk about yet, migration history. You don't have to have this in production. This is a great feature that I use for development. And so what this tells my code here is it basically looks at my properties, it looks at my classes, and it will figure out what's needed in the database. And it actually serializes that information and stores it into the migration history table. And so it can tell if my class data doesn't match what's in my database, it'll give me an error saying, hey, these two don't match, and you have the opportunity to fix that. So we're going to look at some of this right here. If I scroll down, well, actually, let's go all the way down the line here. Create my migration history table. We're going to create our ASP.NET roles table, create our index on there. ASP.NET user roles. So all down the line is creating everything that's in this database. That's all this is. The very end here insert in the migration history. And if we look at this data, you can't understand it. This is all just binary data. And that's basically a representation of your entity framework classes. And if you change them, it no longer matches this representation here. And it knows, hey, you have pending changes that you haven't written to your database yet. It gives you a great way to script things out. And I'll show you how we can do that. So the very next demo, we're going to customize this table a little bit more. I just wanted to show you this to start. This is how you can generate basic scripts. Another thing that you can do here is if you right-click on your database here in Server Explorer, you can browse in SQL Server Object Explorer. And notice you get your database here. And you're like, all right, well, what's the difference? I've got the Server Explorer, shows me my database and tables there.
Adam, are you able to zoom up that package manager console?
Certainly, sir.
Oh, look at that. I didn't even know you could.
So the two things I ran there, I enabled migrations. That's what I did first. Secondly, I called this update database. And all of the code here, so all of my notes that I have for each of my demos, I keep in little, in a notepad document, some text document here. And all of this, including the demos, will be published as one package afterwards too. So if there's a command that you're seeing, you're like, I don't understand what that is, you'll be able to go through each of these demos here and see exactly what I did for each one afterwards. And I'll actually refer to these as we go through the day, because sometimes it's easier just to copy paste than type things like that out. All right, so back to this window here. What's the difference between Server Explorer and this one here? Well, we get a little bit more functionality here. This shows me the entire server, the database is on there. And from here, you have the ability, let's go back here again. From here, you have the ability to create a new database project from this. So, all right, great, we've got these scripts. What if I want something I need to maintain? No problem. You can create a new project. I'll just accept the defaults here. And on the right-hand side, it's created a database project for me. And it's importing all of my database stuff, is looking at that whole database. And doing a similar thing as that script, but a little bit more organized manner. This is meant just as one script you can apply your database. This here, if we view the code for each of these, gives us it broken down by table. So we can see all of our individual scripts. We can manage this project. We could add it to source control. We can hand this over to our DBA. So this is another way of scripting it. It just depends on your environment and which way you want to do it. All right, so let me close this out. Now, I didn't apply this. This was just a script I generated. I didn't apply it yet. In the first case here, I actually don't need to, because this is the initial state of my database. I just wanted to show you can script the initial database here. And then we can script changes going forward as well. Now, one other thing before we look at some more slides and demos I want to touch upon is how we do authorization based on this sample project. So let's get out of the database mode, the database way of thinking for a second here. User logs in. How do we prevent them from going to our account controller? Now, for those using web forms, all this means is that on the URL, when you specify /account, it's actually going to bring you to this class. And then if you say login, not ligin, login, it's going to actually look for a method in this class named login. So easy way to kind of navigate your MVC code.
What if you're using web forms?
So I'll show you the web forms in a second. Excellent question. So here, this prevents somebody from just going to that URL. What's to prevent somebody who is not logged in? So if I go here to, let's go to, let's look at a protected method in here, and I'll explain what I'm doing in a second here. Oh, what's a good one?
So any route that resolves to that action will return an unauthorized response.
If I'm not logged in.
Yeah.
So if I go here, let me run this. I stopped debugging, so let me go back. OK, error occurred, processing request. Did I mess up the URL here? The idea that I want to show you is anything that I want to go to an account, I can't access anything there by default because it's protected.
Yeah.
Well, you say, well, of course you can. If you log in, you can surely access that. Well, let's break it down here. If you have the authorized attribute here, if I only want administrators to be able to access this method, you can do it like this. You can say authorize roles equals administrators. And that checks to see if you have that role defined for you. Just having it as it was by default here, this simply says, well, we don't care what your roles are, you just have to be authenticated. So everything in here by default is protected. I can't get to any of these methods. And again, most of these methods here just relate to something on your query, on the URL. So account/login, account/logoff, account/forgot password. Well, surely, even though this is protected, surely I can access login without being logged in, right? Surely I can go to account login without being logged in. That's why we do this here, allow anonymous. So every method in here is protected. You have to be logged in to access any method in here, unless you override it by saying allow anonymous. Now on the web form side, let's open up another instance of Visual Studio 2015 and go back to that web forms project, which was, we'll just create a new one. Web forms. Slightly different, well, it's actually quite a bit different in web forms. The way it works in web forms is the way it's worked in web forms for a long, long time. Since I think probably 2005. And that is if we want to protect our account folder. So it's a little bit different thinking here. If we want to protect our account folder, we look over here at the web config in that folder. I don't know if you can see that there. In our account folder that we have web config. So let's go ahead and go into that web config. Again, this is not your main project web config. This is just web.config in my account folder. And here, it shows you the location path manage.aspx, deny all users. And everything else here is not protected. Now let's look at our actual main web config here and see if we have anything else listed in there. So that was the location path. OK, so there's nothing else specified in your default web config. So just in the web config in that folder, we're saying deny users to be able to go to manage.aspx unless you happen to be authorized. So a little bit different than using the attribute. That's one of the reasons I kind of like MVC here. It makes it pretty easy just to specify right on your code methods here exactly what it is. I don't have to go look in another file. But I just want to show you how you kind of do that in both here. All right, let's talk about some other things here. So customizing the SQL database and the entities that are in that database. All right, let's talk again about our identity user, our application user store. Identity user, we saw that happen to exist in the entity framework namespace for identity. So we can easily change that. We get an application user that inherits from that, and we're going to work with that. Application user store, that is also an entity framework implementation. We've already looked at that. That's the user store that we use to access anything for the user. Now, all of our default fields happen to exist on identity user. We saw that too. We looked at that identity user class. In fact, let's go back over. I'm going to close out web forms here. Go to our identity user class. I'm sorry, our application user class, which inherits from identity user. And let's look at that class, identity user. If I expand this out a little bit, we can see that this actually inherits from another identity user. And this one has all these properties on here. These are the things that you see by default in the database. So Entity Framework looks at identity user and creates these fields for you in the database. Well, if you want to add a custom field, it seems like you would be in trouble because this is in a compiled library that Microsoft adds. You can't add new fields to that. Well, that's the great thing with inheritance. Application user inherits from identity user. So that makes it easy for us to add things because all we need to do is add to application user. And we can add our own custom fields there.
So there was a thread in the chat room. Somebody was talking about using a separate table to store various membership profile information, and maybe even storing that in a separate database. And really, although both of those would be possible, they might not be necessary, right? You'd have a little bit more elegant and organized solution if you were using the entity framework and using inheritance and extending the core functionality so that entity framework and ASP.NET Identity are getting what they expect a user to be, all the fields that they expect a user to be, especially the critical ones like the keys and such. But then there's also other fields in there that you care about. Now you've got it kind of all in one place.
Yeah, what if you want shipping address, or if you want any other field you can store their customer or profile? So let's check that out here. All the other identity tables have a backend class that Entity Framework is initialized with. So we have the ability to change essentially where Entity Framework looks for these entities and where it looks for the tables, meaning we can change any of these table names. And we can also change some of the scheme up a little bit as well. So you might say, well, what if I don't want code first? OK. If you have, let's say, already an existing database, that's no problem. You can point this to your existing database. You need to make sure that you support those same fields in your database, which generating the SQL scripts here and migrating them over there makes it easy. If you don't like that format, then you can surely write your own custom user store. What if you already have a database with a different user table, or you want to create a different user table rather than ASP.NET user? What if you want, or ASP.NET users, what if you want something different here? We'll look at that as well. And what if you want to allow a user to edit different fields, profile information, for example? We'll check that out as well. All right, customizing. So we've got a couple things to run through on this. Let's go back, close this one out. We are done with that. And this is everything we're going to be doing. Again, all this code is going to be available for you to use. So I'm going to take this guy out here and add this. Let's go back to our MVC project here and talk about what we want to do. We want to add a custom field to this table here. Let's say we want shipping address or any other profile type field. That is no problem. Remember, identity user maps to this table. That has all the fields defined that end up in this table. Application user inherits from that. Now we have a class that we can change, because we can't change identity user. So if we do something like, let's come back to our package manager console. I'm going to ask Entity Framework, update database script. See if there's any pending changes to our database right now. There shouldn't be, right? We haven't changed anything. All right. Our SQL script came up empty. So far, so good. I'm going to add a field on here, public string shipping address. Compile. OK. Now let me go ahead and run this application. And let me log in. And I just put in any fake password there. This is the error I wanted you to see. The model backing this context has changed since the database was created. So it says, hey, we are storing information in the database about your class. And that class has now changed. It doesn't match what we know in our database. So we're going to bomb out intentionally here. We don't have to use these code-first migrations. But I like that for me, because what I can then do here is I can say, you know what, I've added some fields. So I'm going to add a migration. And I'll just name it anything I want. Added shipping. And it actually is going to generate some classes over here under migrations. There's some great courses out there that you can find on Entity Framework and migrations. The simple part of it I want to show you, though, is that we can simply call update database again here and show me the script for what's changed. There we go. Alter table, add shipping address, and insert this current migration so we know what your classes look like into the database. All right, I like it. Ship it. I'm just going to update the database. There we go. If I come back to this table and I refresh it, there's shipping address. So again, all I did was I added my custom field. I added the migration. and then I updated the database, and it pushed it out to the table for us. Now, if you don't want to use code first migrations, again, that's fine. You don't have to. Everything will still work behind the scenes. I like this feature, though. It makes it easy for me to develop and manage my scripts and versions. All right, let's get a little bit more advanced here. Let's say I want to change names of a bunch of these tables over here. So let's say I think we're going to do I think we're going to rename this guy. Problem is right now, if we go ahead and we build this, we get a bunch of errors here because we have things that are specifically looking for application user. We're initializing our user manager, saying, hey, we're dealing with an application user. We've just changed that. So what I can do right now, let me match this word and replace that. All right. So first thing I did so far was I just changed the name of that table from application user to just user. And then I just updated all the, I just refactored my application and changed all those names in my application. So everything refers to user instead of application user. Next, I need to tell Entity Framework, hey, I also don't like the names of these tables. I want to change it up a bit. Again, it has built-in convention on what those tables should look like. It needs to know, any system that's going to use a database needs to know what to look for, so it just provides this by default, but we can change that. And we can use that here with this onModelCreating method. That goes into our DB context. And as Jeremy said, the DB context, think of as like the manager. That talks to Entity Framework, tells us about our database, the classes we're going to be storing out to our database. And we can tell Entity Framework that, hey, when you're going to create your models here, when you're going to make the mappings between your classes and the database. So clearly, we have something called application user, but that maps to this in the database. So there's something telling it to go from my class name of application user to ASP.NET users. And so that's what we're changing the mappings on here. This is essentially template code you can find on the net. You just need to onModelCreating. And we're saying, all right, our user, that's going to map to a table in the database called user. And we're just saying, hey, instead of using ID, like rather than using ID, I like using an actual full column name, user ID. ID to me is kind of ambiguous.
This is so fun in here. I love the way Entity Framework works. It gives you a fluent API here that allows you to really create a custom mapping between the way that you want things to look in your code, or maybe the way that you're constrained that things look in your code, and the way that the way you want things to look in your database, in your tables,
yes,
or the way that you're constrained to, more likely. And so you get to create this mapping. And if you're working on a greenfield application where everything's just fresh and new and you can make it look like whatever you want, I was just discussing in the chat room, oftentimes you just want to tell it, you know what, drop the database and recreate it for me. I don't have any data to save, I'm just developing here. But if you've got something in place, that's where these migrations really help out. You've already got 17,000 records. You just need to add a column, or you just need to change.
Don't drop the database. I've got too much data there.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yep. So, and the other thing too, I've worked at places where instead of like a user ID, I think they had this weird convention. It was something like every ID was called primary key or something silly like that, which as you're coding just drives you crazy.
Yeah.
And so I want to basically say, I want it to be called primary key in the database for my existing database.
But in my code, I'm going to call it my thing.
In my code, I'm going to map it to user.id, something like that. All right, so let's keep this here. So we're telling Entity Framework, not only are we changing our user table, in other words, ASP.NET users, we're also going to change behind the scenes our user role. So our roles, logins, claims, and this roles table. We're going to change all of them to our own custom names. So let's compile this, make sure everything works so far. All right, Package Manager console. Well, I made a bunch of changes. So I'm going to add a new migration. And I'm going to say, hey, script that out for me. Let's see what that looks like. And notice it's calling store procedure sp_rename. to rename all that stuff for me. And then it updates my new model information in the database.
That right there is code I do not want to write.
Code I don't want to write, and watch this. We just update our local database here, update-database. Voila. Now I want to make sure, I'm going to control F5 this. I'm going to log in. My database has already changed, so we'll go look at that in 1 second. I just want to show you this. I log in. I'm able to successfully log in, so my system still works. So far, so good. I come over here, refresh my tables. See that? I've completely customized this. Now I have a user table. Maybe I don't like pluralized names. Oh, actually realized I did make an error. Notice roles doesn't match everything else I have here. In my, sorry, wrong class here. In my models class. If I look down here, I'm sure I had an S on there. Yep. I erroneously added an S there. I will drop that S off and come back here and add a migration, changed. Let's be specific about this. And if I make more changes that I want to happen under the same migration, let's say I made 5 other code changes, I could actually make the same call again, and it just packages all up under that same migration for me.
It's like Git for databases.
Git for database. Update database. Perfect. Let's refresh this database here. Look at that. I'm now renamed to role.
Hey,
real easy.
Speaking of role and roles, I think I saw on a slide there you were mentioning that there is room for 1 role. Is there room for 1 role, or do I have the possibility of putting somebody into multiple roles? Maybe they're an administrator as well as an employee, and then authenticating them if they're in any of those roles.
Absolutely. The syntax there on your controller. Let's go back to like my account controller. So notice roles is string. So if we type in roles equals just like that.
Great.
There's your multiple roles right there.
Now what if I want to dynamically change those roles at runtime?
That is a good question. I don't know if I've ever done it. Let me ponder that for 1 second. So being this is a claims-based system, I am imagining that behind the scenes you could change your claims at runtime. I would just have to test it out though.
Yeah.
But definitely doable.
It might not be the right application for roles specifically. That might beg for a claim.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good call. Okay, so let me save this here. And let's go back. So we talked about essentially customizing table data classes. Now adding profile data. Any data you want to go in that class, you can add it. What if you say, you know what, I don't want my user profile data to be stored in that particular class? That's no problem. You don't have to. Entity Framework supports using multiple databases in your application, supports multiple tables. You could add your own separate table to your context and manage the database with that as well. And there's a whole handful of ways that you can use the built-in stuff. I'm showing you right now how you can add on to the Entity Framework classes. But anything else is just additional Entity Framework code. If you want another table, you can just add that to your classes, and it just works. There's nothing. There's no magic there behind it. All right, let's talk now about customizing the storage provider. So we've looked at Entity Framework databases. Mm-hmm. What if I don't want to use Entity Framework? I want to use some other storage provider. Remember that Identity User, as it stands now, is a specific Entity Framework implementation of iUser. So Identity User won't work for us the way it stands right now. We need to create our own custom user class because we don't know what the backend data store is going to look like. We don't know how it's going to store properties, what it's going to store. So we're going to create our own custom class there. Now our user store, as I mentioned, that is what talks directly to whatever our data store is. So in this case, we need our own custom user store because the one that we're using now talks to Entity Framework. And the one that we're going to have to create is going to have to talk to RavenDB. So we just create our own user store and identity user. And then if you want to manage roles in that database, you need to create your own custom role store as well. Pretty simple process. So this is how you kind of migrate away from what's been given out of the box. That's what the little icon is in the lower right-hand corner. It's out of the box.
Out of the box.
Out of the box. All right, now we are going to look at a demo for RavenDB. What if you want some other databases? Maybe you want to use MySQL or Azure Table Storage, etc. There's a couple links I have in here. I have them at the end as well, where we have a link to various repositories that people have written some great code to be able to do all of that. It's fairly simple to write your own too. As you'll see, the code that we look at is going to be pretty easy. All right, so using custom storage RavenDB. I'm going to open up an existing demo that I have here, which is some code that I pulled off the net. Also, I have those links at the end here. And what we have is a web application here, RavenDB starter kit. So I've installed RavenDB onto the system. Actually, Jeremy has installed RavenDB onto the system. Thank you, Jeremy. And I believe, here it is right here. So I've gone to the local port for RavenDB. After I installed it, it installs as a service on the local system. RavenDB is not a relational database like we're used to, like SQL Server. It's a document storage. You take something and you store it in a database, and it just works. That can change from insert to insert to insert. You can basically take this, insert it, take something else and insert it. You don't have to define the strict criteria ahead of time of what you're going to be storing in there. Relational databases have their uses, and these types of databases have their uses as well. So this is running at localhost 8080. This is interfacing with the RavenDB service installed on the system. Now going over to the code, this is a website that is referencing a custom project here. So this website does mostly what our existing template already did, except it's going to use this custom class here, this custom project that has its own, just like I mentioned before, identity user and user store. That's it. So let's look at the code here. And the first thing we have is identity user. Gentleman that wrote this said, OK, we need to work off an iUser interface. That iUser interface, let's go to the definition of that. Didn't want to start that. Let me F12 to go to definition. Now notice, this is not in any framework. This is a base interface that's part of identity, iUser. And we see that iUser requires an ID and a username. So you can extend upon that as much as you want. Our identity user class added all those other entity framework fields, all the other fields that ended up in our database. This is the basic iUser. So this custom identity user inherits from that. And it defines a bunch of its own properties here. Username, password hash, virtually the same types of fields that we've seen, although we can customize this however that we want. You will find, though, if you are trying to use like email confirmation and you don't have these fields, clearly it's not going to work because there's some things behind the scenes that are looking for specific fields. So it depends on what functionality in the identity system you're accessing. If you're doing anything with phone numbers, of course, it's going to be looking for a phone number in your schema. So here we have some fields defined, and all we do is we initialize it. This is some template code. Identity user login, we have an identity user claim, identity user by name, some basic classes. Again, this is fairly boilerplate template code from implementation to implementation. It's real easy. We just define identity user, has some fields we want to store, and our user store. Now the user store, again, remember, the user store is responsible for talking to the database. And so that's where we come in with these interfaces here. This abstracts away our data access layer. So RavenDB, we're going to be talking through iDocument session to it. Now if we look at the starter kit here, let's go to our account controller. And notice we have an application user manager. Application user manager uses the the regular user manager with application user. What is application user? It's our custom identity user. So that is where we're pulling this into our web project. And this custom user store is using here as well. So let's run this project, make sure that's my default one. It is. So again, all we need is a custom user store and a custom identity user. This template actually does a couple additional things here too, which makes it exceptionally cool. Let me register first and I'll show you. Clear my breakpoint, register. All right, check your email and confirm your account. You must be confirmed before you log in. So this has account confirmation built in. We're going to look at some kind of extended features in the very last module of the day. And just so I don't have to go check my email, we've got local purposes only. Here's a confirmation link. Although this project actually did just send me out an email, this project interfaces with SendGrid and also interfaces with Twilio to send out SMS text messages. So I'm going to confirm my account through this link right here. Log in without caps, because that is a sure fail way. There we go. I'm logged in. If I go over to RavenDB, and we can see right here, there's my new account in there. So the code on the web side is pretty template code. We have all the same stuff that we're used to seeing here. If we look at login, for example, login talks to our user manager, finds the user, checks if their email is confirmed. If it's not, we send them a confirmation token. And then we call in the sign-in manager. Remember I said that we'd like to talk to these high-level classes. Sign-in manager, application user manager, we use an application user. Just a few classes you need to understand here. So same code. We sign in. This was the exact same code between our MVC implementation, our web forms implementation, and now a RavenDB MVC implementation. The exact same code.
So the benefit there is that if you ever want to unplug Raven and plug in Mongo and unplug Mongo and plug in DocumentDB, if you ever want to use different providers behind the scenes for any of this stuff, that's easy to do, and your application itself doesn't need to change, which makes sense.
Doesn't need to change within reason. So we have our own, like if we look in here, let's take application user. And we go to definition in our web project. That is an identity user. And if we look at here, you'll notice that identity user is a custom implementation. So if we're going to use some other custom provider, then we just swap out identity user here with whatever other class is our custom implementation. We could call it our MySQL identity user, for example. And then we would find our references to our user store. Let's find that with whole word only. We would find this guy right here. Swap it out with our actual user store implementation here. And that's it. So very, very pluggable. A couple code changes, not many code changes at all. So pretty cool, right? We can add on very easily to any of this. I have a couple resources here. We got about 6 minutes left here. I'm wondering if we should try something a little adventurous here.
Let's be adventurous.
Let's be adventurous.
If it doesn't work, we can ask some.
If it doesn't work, then we only have 6 minutes left. Let's do something a little bit more. Let's do something a little bit more advanced with our last project we were dealing with here. Let's go back to some of my demo notes here. This will be, if we can get this one done, this will be kind of cool. All right. So what we need to do, let me open up these classes, our identity model. All right, we're gonna change this up a little bit. In our database right now, we are using a, go to our table definition. Notice that by default, our user ID, even though it looks like a GUID, is being stored as a string. So maybe you say, I want to use an integer. I don't want to use a string as your user identifier. I might caution against using an integer, but I've definitely seen many databases where you are dealing with an existing database format that uses integers, so you might just have to plug in on top of that. So you want to change that. So I'm going to do a couple things here. I'm going to add a new class here. We're going to add a class called identity. Let me replace this with my guy here. I'm going to zoom out on this code just a little bit here, just to make it a little bit easier to work with temporarily. And we're going to change this up a little bit more as well. We are working against the clock here, so we'll see how much we can get done on this. Copy out my namespace here. This was web application 3. Web application 3. So what I did here was, because I'm changing the key, I actually need to, that has a much more of an effect. There's a bunch of other things it affects here. So I have to create my own custom user login class that does nothing more than inherit from identity user login, saying, hey, I'm changing up that key. So for all of our tables here, we need to basically say we're keying off a different value now. Not for all, for most. Our identity user role now keys off an integer, and this keys off an integer rather than the default string. So notice how we can just pass that in here. And when we compile this, I've also changed some of my table names here, my entity names. Let's compile this. And then it's an issue of going through and just changing everything here. And you'll notice that when I just look at all these errors, and there's going to be a bunch that we have to change. This is showing me a little red squiggly here. I'll zoom this up so we can see it. All right. Notice we got a squiggly. Well, since we're changing the default one, we need to tell all of our interfaces that we are now using an integer instead. We compile again. So we just keep finding these guys around. It's just a matter of going through and finding them all and fixing them up. And again, there's a bunch that you have to fix. Let's see if we can get this done in time.
Bum, bum, bum.
Dun, dun, dun. We'll see if we
coding like a madman.
We'll see if we can totally change the key implementation in our database in time for this.
Be impressive.
Alrighty. I missed something here. And this is one of the things, I don't know if you ever heard it, there's, how did it go? It was, it's like a play on the 99 bottles of beer on the wall, but it's something about code, and then you compile it.
I don't know what it is.
Oh, it's like, I don't know, 50 bugs in my code, 50 bugs in my code, fix them all, compile again, 101 bugs in my code. This is essentially what happens here. You're going through and everything, you got to go through and fix all these references in here. And once we fix them all, we're going to get a couple more errors that we got to replace. Alrighty here, so we've got change that string to int. And of course, right, we had 2 errors, now we've got 34 again. And now, here's where we can do kind of a global replace on a bunch of them. So this guy right here, get user ID returns a string. So we can actually replace those with int. If it doesn't work for everything, there's a couple we actually have to revert. And we'll see here, right here, there's one that we have to revert. Actually, this one we just changed to an int. Oops. So this is one of those types of deals where as you go through, you're just going to have to find a couple things to fix. The whole process should take you probably less than 10 minutes. Again, it's just a matter of going through and changing all these references in your application. Any good questions coming through on the chat here? Looks like we are just about out of time So I might not get this fully compiled here.
No, I think we've answered them either orally or we've answered them in the chat room. So we're
Very good.
pretty good.
Very good. Give me, let's try for like 30 more seconds to see what we can get done here. Oops. Two more errors. And
Really is a strong advantage to strong typing in ways. I do a lot of JavaScript development, and that's one thing you don't get.
yes, that's true. This would just work, and then when you deploy your application, then you go through and trying to fix all the bugs then. All right. Build failed. Where's my errors here? All right, we get the idea. We've got 5 errors left on here, just a few more that we would go in and fix then, and then we'd compile. I would ideally delete my database and have it regenerate it in this case, because I would just change all of my keys. Any framework, the code first migration works great in a lot of cases, but when you do something really complex like this, when you're adding, you're overriding all these tables and changing up all your keys, sometimes it gets a little confused. It's meant for certain scenarios, but I'm assuming I have an existing database with a different format here, or I'm creating it that way from scratch. In that case, it would work just fine. All right. Well, we've covered quite a bit of good content here in this one. So
that was really a lot. I was really impressed with the Raven.
That's pretty cool,
demo.
right?
Yep, completely
Easy.
Completely third party.
Complete third party. You can find a lot of providers on the net. I have the links there for it, so check those out. There might be some questions around Web API.
Yeah.
Web API is handled a little bit differently because you're not dealing with these kind of redirects to login and registration.
You don't
pages.
have any UI.
Right, you don't have any UI, so it's handled a little bit differently. If you are curious in implementation there, check out the references on there. There's some great blog posts on the net because it is different than what we are showing you here today.
What about the source code for your Raven project or any of the other projects that you're showing in this?
The Raven project I have listed on here, the RavenDB identity provider on the slide. Check that out. There's all the source code. You just install RavenDB from their website, and then you download the source code. And outside of the SendGrid and Twilio configuration, it just works.
Great.
Yep. Thank you. We'll see you back shortly.